The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Unless you stayed away from news over the weekend, you probably heard that 12 police officers were shot, 5 of whom died at the hands, or I guess at the gun, of 25-year-old black man Micah Xavier Johnson, who, according police, wanted to kill white people, specifically white cops. We did some YouTube-only coverage over the weekend. We know way more now than we knew then, so let's talk about it. Let's figure out exactly what happened here. Now, much of the news circulating around the nature of the protests related to police brutality and perceived racial bias by police across the country in Dallas surrounding the shootings, or the context within which this shooting took place. The shooter ultimately killed by a police bomb delivered by police robot. We will get into that more later. That also the subject of much discussion. Now, according to police, Micah Xavier Johnson was upset about the Black Lives Matter movement and the recent police shootings of black men elsewhere in the United States. The suspect also was not affiliated with any group and was acting alone, as best as we can now tell. Now, Lewis, you predicted this. When we started doing the individual stories about here is one incident of a police shooting, here is another incident of a police shooting, a shooting by police, Lewis said, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but soon people will start killing police, and then it is all going to break loose. All hell will break loose.
Mm-hmm. It's just you can look at history, and this type of thing repeats itself over and over again in different ways, but similar idea. This is what happens.
This was the deadliest day for law enforcement since 9/11. I mean, this was no small thing.
Hard to imagine, right? I mean, it's incredible.
We have a few different videos to play for you. Here is one, and I will sort of describe for people who are not watching what it is that we are looking at here. We see in this video the shooter sort of using some pillars, some building pillars as cover and shooting around them. And this video, I don't know if we have the exact moments where the shooter actually is sort of engaging an individual officer directly. I think we do have that at some point here. And the reaction from many, Lewis, including from us who were in studio with Benjamin Dixon when we first saw this, was, this looks like someone who has training in what it is that he is doing here. And indeed, we ultimately found out that this is someone who was a military reservist who did serve a tour in Afghanistan, although I believe did not see combat. And then, Lewis, we can skip video 2. Let's go to video 3. Just the total and utter chaos in the crowd here, reminiscent of a war zone. So as usual, public and corporate media, the public and corporate media, they want to find the thing to blame. Violence against black people by cops is the thing to blame. No. One racist individual, Micah Xavier Johnson, is the thing to blame. And for others, gun safety regulation and the availability of guns is the thing to blame. We're going to talk about all of these issues, and we can't ignore that there is a lot swirling now about the Black Lives Matter movement. And as we know, Lewis, although the Black Lives Matter movement, in principle, a group that is seeking to put the spotlight on very important issues, we have seen individual tactics used by BLM be completely counterproductive. But that doesn't even matter here. I want to remind you, this individual was not affiliated with Black Lives Matter. There were some early claims that he was affiliated with some other radical group, and I'm not even going to mention them because that appears not to have been true. And it's really, really important when we have these conversations, let's talk about all of the issues that are related, but let's also not overstate ones that aren't.
You can look all over the internet and see people complaining about how, pointing to this, saying how violent BLM is. And
Yeah.
I mean, certainly there are, like you said, there have been things done by BLM that are stupid and probably pointless
And counterproductive, as President Obama. Yeah.
But this has nothing to do with BLM.
Let's break down the many issues of this shooting in Dallas, Texas, by 25-year-old black man Micah Xavier Johnson. Let me speak completely clearly to you. Yes, this was a racist hate crime by a black man against whites. Some on the right seem to think that the left hesitates to call something a hate crime or terrorism. A hate crime when it's Muslims. Terrorism when it's Muslims, or a hate crime when white people are the victims. In the world of some liberals, supposedly, blacks can never be racist or the perpetrators of racist hate crimes. If that's true, then that's shameful. But for me, it is very, very clear. A hate crime, as I will show you here, a hate crime is, and we have the definition for you that we will put up, a hate crime is a crime motivated by racial, sexual, or other prejudice, typically one involving violence. As we heard multiple times now, Lewis, the suspect said he wanted to kill white people, specifically white police officers. Case closed, right? Whatever else this qualifies as, this is a hate crime. It is a racist hate crime by a black guy against white people, period. And, for all the accusations about the left hesitates to say that may be true. I don't watch enough so-called left media to know, maybe, but I have no qualms about saying that whatsoever.
I also wouldn't have a problem putting this in the category of domestic terrorism either.
Right.
Yeah, because the two are not mutually exclusive. So, I mean, yes, I think we can also call it that.
Well, a number of tweets popped up after these horrible, vile acts, people saying this guy is a martyr. Micah Xavier Johnson is a hero or a freedom fighter. He was doing what needed to be done. Bakari Sellers, who was on with us last week, said it on CNN. I've been saying it all weekend. No matter what legitimate issues need to be addressed with regard to police use of force, bias in policing, whatever, Micah Johnson is not a martyr. He is not a hero. Everyone tweeting and applauding him should be ashamed of themselves. And it is terrorism, as Lewis said. Terrorism, the use of violence and intimidation in the pursuit of political aims. Clearly, this was an individual who was upset about some of the political issues in the country that we have discussed. There can never be apologetics for hate crimes. There can never be apologia for terrorism, period. Full stop. I don't know how else to say it, Lewis. Can I be any clearer this evening?
No, it's you got to look at the bigger picture. I mean, did this act, is this act going to make police officers realize that there could be much more severe consequences for their actions? Maybe, but at the same time, you're also probably giving every police officer in this country an even itchier trigger finger, making them more afraid, making them more paranoid.
The fear policing, which is what much of the problem connects to, right? Not so much overt racial bias, but fear in policing that is racially tinged. That's going to escalate because of this, and we'll talk later about President Obama's statements on that. Now, this is not just a racial hate crime and domestic terrorism. It is also a gun safety issue, and it illuminates some pretty glaring problems with gun safety regulations. You do not need a state permit in Texas to purchase firearms, and you are not required to register them with the state either. And there's a new Texas law, Lewis, that went into effect in January, which allows residents to openly carry handguns without an open carry permit. In other words, you have a concealed weapon permit, you can open carry. Do you realize that this means if you have a handgun and no open carry permit, you can walk around in public with a gun displayed, ready to commit a crime, on your way to commit a crime, and there's nothing police can do because it is legal?
Yeah, and let's not forget about that other Texas law that happened recently where you can carry a concealed pistol on campuses.
Right.
There's also that. And yes, if this guy, handguns aside, I mean, if this guy didn't have access to such a lethal weapon,
right,
perhaps things might have ended a little differently.
Well, what's fascinating and horrifying is that there was actually a man who was at this protest as an open carry demonstrator who was detained by police for a while in the midst of this chaos. This is not someone who was even involved in the shooting. But these are police resources that at a time when we should have been going after the bad guy with the gun, and I know that it's sort of cliche to even say that this was a good guy with a gun, but it was at least a guy with a gun not involved in this crime. A neutral guy with a gun. Police resources were focused on that guy instead. And lastly, in Texas, you can also carry around long guns, rifles and shotguns. They don't even have to be concealed as long as you're not doing it in a way that is, quote, calculated to cause alarm. Tell me a more subjective definition than calculated to cause alarm. So you can walk around with a rifle, Lewis, and as long as it's not, quote, calculated to cause alarm, you can walk right up to wherever you're going to shoot people because you're not doing anything against the law. And this is all part of the problem. The difficulty of identifying good and bad guys with guns and the fact that more guns in more places very clearly doesn't help.
Yeah. I saw this a lot in Texas. You know, I working downtown. I mean, I would see the demonstrations and people with the guns, and it's clear what's happening when there's a big demonstration. But when it's one person walking around, I mean, what are you really going to do with that rifle in downtown Austin, walking around door to door in the streets? I mean, I wish we could live in a place where it's understood that that person is up to no good instead of someone just deciding that they want to carry a gun around because they can.
Send me your thoughts on Twitter about this. I'm on Twitter at dpacman. Lewis is on Twitter at lewismotamedy. Much more coverage about this coming up.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is David Dowless. David, thank you so much for being a David Pakman Show member. This is viewer-supported and viewer-funded media, and I encourage you to sign up and do what David did at davidpakman.com/membership. I'll also remind you later today we have a big email promotion going out. Huge membership discount. Everybody who's on our mailing list as of a few hours after the taping of this show will get an email with a link to that membership special. If you think you may have missed it, feel free to email in. This is a really big special, and it's a great opportunity to get a membership at a discounted rate. Also, we will be taking your calls this week. The day is Wednesday at 1:15 p.m. Eastern Time. The number is 617-830-4750. And anybody who wants to call in, set a little reminder on your calendar, 1:15 p.m. Wednesday. Lewis, I've said it before, and I will say it again. If you ever shop on Amazon.com, the shopping you do can support our work. If before shopping, you go to davidpakman.com/Amazon, somebody, Lewis, over the weekend, buying the entire Game of Thrones streaming for $20 to $40 per season, that strikes me as quite pricey. And I recently looked up, because Battlestar Galactica was removed from Netflix, as you know, Lewis. You mourned that for weeks. And it is available on Amazon, but it's like $35 per season or something like that. It is absolutely nuts. I want to rewatch it, but that seems crazy to me.
Well, yeah. If you were to buy the DVDs, it might be similar, right?
Who buys DVDs anymore, though?
I don't know. Nobody, I guess.
Nobody you know, anyway.
John does.
John, okay.
After the EMP attack, you're probably going to want DVDs.
Yes,
they
absolutely.
might just be easier.
Although I found out that it is available, Battlestar Galactica, with a Hulu subscription. You're hugely into Game of Thrones. I've seen 10 minutes of one episode. Why? Is there something going on now that would explain someone buying the entire series right now? Just general fandom?
Not particularly. I mean, one season just ended, and maybe they just want to get caught up so they can watch the next one.
Got it.
Yeah.
All right. Also, people buying Mr. Robot Season 1. This week, Mr. Robot Season 2 starts up. Every time I recommend Mr. Robot to someone, Lewis, they look at me, they say, what channel is that on? Say, it's a USA show. And usually when they're done laughing, they say, USA doesn't make good shows. And I say, just check it out. And every single person has thanked me, Lewis, saying it is one of their favorite shows in recent years.
Yes, everyone says it's good. I have to watch it. Haven't done it yet.
davidpakman.com/Amazon before shopping on Amazon to support the work we do. We will also be taking your live calls Wednesday, 1:15 p.m. Eastern Time, 617-830-4750. All right, Lewis, this is disgusting. An extreme anti-Israeli on-campus group that we've discussed before called Students for Justice in Palestine has linked the Dallas shootings that left 5 police officers dead and the shootings of black people by police more generally to Israel. There are so many important angles and elements to talk about the Dallas shooting: racism, hate crimes, black lives, political extremism, guns, gun safety, American culture of violence, PTSD, on and on and on. But is Israel the real lens through which we should analyze the Dallas shooting? No, this is shameful and embarrassing. And when all you have, Lewis, as I like to say, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And when you are focused on demonizing Israel at any opportunity, every news event looks like an opportunity to criticize Israel. And that is exactly what this Facebook post from the NYU chapter of Students for Justice in Palestine did, saying, in the past 48 hours, another 2 black men have been lynched by the police. The total number of black people lynched by cops in 2016 now totals 136. We must remember that many U.S. police departments train with the Israeli Defense Forces. The same forces behind the genocide of black people in America are behind the genocide of Palestinians. What this means is that Palestinians must stand with our black comrades. We must struggle for their liberation. It is as important as our own. Alton Sterling is as important as Ali Dawabsheh. Palestinian liberation and black liberation go together. We must recognize this and commit to building for it. Do you recognize the sick irony of this ridiculous Facebook post? They are attempting to criticize racism in the United States by blaming Jews in the Middle East for police shootings. Here's the real danger of this, and I know people will write to me and say, okay, David, fine, Jews aren't specifically responsible for these shootings, but Palestinian liberation is directly related to the anger in the U.S. about police officers, which led to Philando Castile and all of these other shootings. No. If you were wanting to have a real conversation about U.S. police violence, be it racially motivated or motivated by power-hungry police or disregard for the law or whatever, if you want real effective conversations about dealing with police violence, you're short-circuiting it by making Israeli foreign policy and Jews in the Middle East the focus. You're proactively hurting the cause you claim to support. And to provide some context, this is not NYU SJP's first humiliating attempt to link Israel to anything under the sun. Late last year, they signed on to a statement that linked high tuition costs at a City College of New York school to the school's supposedly Zionist administration. This is vile, shameful, but most importantly, Lewis, it is counterproductive if your goal is to address bias in policing in the United States.
Mm-hmm. This is, I don't feel I really need to say much about it. I would be embarrassed and quite alarmed if I were working for NYU, if I were a member of whatever board they have that has to deal with stuff like this.
Well, sadly, many of those people probably like the message.
There has to be a line, even for those people, and if this doesn't cross it, what will?
This is problematic with regard to the specific incident, but it's problematic bigger picture also because the Black Lives Matter movement more broadly has made anti-Israeli statements, recently retweeting an article posing Black Lives Matter as supporting the dark-skinned Palestinians over the white supremacist Israeli Jews. This is sickening and destructive, particularly when you consider that Jews and American blacks have this long history of working together for non-discrimination against black people. And these attempts are some of the lowest of the low to drive a wedge between two groups with a very long history of working together that long predates Black Lives Matter. These people, by and large, have no idea about the historical realities of the situation. You know about Mississippi burning, right? This infamous, world-famous case of 3 civil rights workers that were murdered working for racial equality in Mississippi in 1964. Yeah, one was a black guy, and the other 2 were Jews. These are the white supremacist Jews, the Ashkenazi white supremacist Jews that in Israel are doing every bad thing and causing and related to shootings of black people in the U.S. These are the same people that we're talking about that have a decade-old history of working together. It's disgusting, and there should be no place for this, particularly in academia. Sadly, that's not the reality. I'm going to ask a question, Lewis, and I don't want you to misunderstand the question I'm asking because I do want clarity on this issue. The question is, what was the legality and constitutionality of the police bomb delivered by robot that killed the Dallas shooter? Now, let's stop immediately. My question is not, did the Dallas shooter need to be neutralized because he was killing police officers like he was in a video game? That is not my question. The answer is yes. The question is about the constitutionality and legality of these police bombs. As the Dallas police chief David Brown said, we saw no other option but to use our bomb robot and place a device on its extension for it to detonate where the suspect was. University of California Davis law professor Elizabeth Joe is concerned about the constitutionality here. How do you figure out if the deadly force by police was appropriate? Well, usually you go to the immediate threat posed to the officer or others. But if we are talking about a robot and the police may be far away, how does that compute? When it comes to reasonable deadly force by a robot, what is the legal framework? And there's another sort of PR problem here, which is that these robots are often used to bring cell phones to someone holding hostages in order to get them on the phone with negotiators. Criminals become aware that you might be brought a cell phone to negotiate, or it might actually be a bomb. If hostage takers become aware of that, Lewis, all of a sudden these robots are going to be told to bring one of the hostages the cell phone or whatever. So a number of questions here, and many people understandably don't care. They say this guy needed to be eliminated. What does it matter if police are keeping themselves safer by sending in a robot? All the better.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the police department is going to win this one every time. The idea that this would have been okay if there was a police officer in view who was getting shot at seems ridiculous to me. I say to myself, okay, what about snipers? What's the difference between this and a sniper when the sniper
is not in direct risk of harm?
He's not directly in danger. I know that people are certainly worried about militarization and police overreach. Okay.
Yeah.
In this case, I don't see anything wrong with this, or I don't see anything illegal about it either.
Now, as far as this being the first time police have used bombs in these situations, this isn't true. Back in 1985, police moved in on a house controlled by MOVE, which is a black liberation group, which had boarded up windows and fortified, created sort of a rooftop bunker. They were possessing firearms illegally. Police arrived with arrest warrants for 4 residents of the house, ordered them to come out peacefully. Eventually, it turned into a shootout, and ultimately, there were actually bombs dropped. And here's just a little bit of a report of this by Judy Woodruff, more than 30 years ago at this point.
Between a radical group and city officials leaves 11 people dead.
As the mayor of the city, I accept full and total responsibility for decisions made.
A black neighborhood is destroyed, and 61 innocent families are left homeless.
What is it, a crime to be black in this country?
Tonight, the bombing of West Philly.
From the network of public television stations, a presentation of KCTS Seattle, WNET New York, WPBT Miami, WTVS Detroit, and WGBH Boston. This is Frontline with Judy Woodruff.
Good evening. 2 years ago this month, the Philadelphia police, attempting to arrest members of a radical group called MOVE, dropped a bomb on a West Philadelphia row house. 11...
Right. So, Lewis, not the first time that bombs have been used, although aerial bombing versus a robot-delivered bomb, it is different, but not the first time. And that you've seen that headline circulating time and again, and it is not true.
Yeah, not the first time, not even close. This is a much better option. Let's be clear about that, too, other than aerial dropping of bombs onto residential neighborhoods.
Yeah.
That one is a disturbing example.
Send me your thoughts on this. Send me your thoughts if you have a legal opinion on it. Send me your thoughts if you have an opinion in terms of what is it that needs to be considered in terms of the risk to police officers, etc. This is going to be discussed. It's just one of the many stories that has stemmed from this horrific shooting of police officers in Dallas. Give us a like on Facebook, facebook.com/David Pakman Show, and we'll be back with much more.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined today by John Johnson, an MIT PhD who runs an econometrics consultancy in Washington, D.C. He's also co-author of Everydata, the misinformation hidden in the little data you consume every day. It's so great to talk to you. I think a good way to maybe jump into this is with all of the political polling that's going on and questions and thoughts about, can we trust polls that don't poll cell phones? Or what does the margin of error really mean? Let's just start there. When we see a political poll that says Hillary plus 10 over Trump nationally, and another that says Trump plus 4 over Hillary nationally, how can the average person be sort of moderately well equipped to look at a poll and figure out what we can deduce from it?
Well, it's hard. And so the first thing you have to do is you can't overread any single poll. One of the biggest mistakes I think the media makes is they're trying to tell stories and narratives every day. And so you get these data points. A brand new poll today that has an interesting result suddenly turns into an entire storyline. And that can really cause a lot of problems. First of all, if you were trying to be a better consumer of polls, first thing I would try to remind people to do is remember, what the polls are trying to suggest is they're trying to predict the voting patterns of what is ultimately going to be millions of people with 100 to 1,000 people. And that's an actual really hard statistical problem. So if the types of questions they ask are slightly biased or suggestive in a way that might affect the results, if they ask the wrong people, any of those things can affect the actual results. So what I always do is first, I try to look at how many people were sampled just to see the raw numbers. That's just a helpful metric. And then you mentioned the margin of error. The margin of error is just one type of bias that we can find in polls. The idea that you're trying to predict the voting patterns of millions of people with just a few thousand or a few hundred even, what that margin of error tells you is how statistically confident we are that the result, the real result, in other words, if you've polled every single person, how statistically confident are the result we got from our poll is actually close to that. So what I look at is the margin of error, how big or small that is. And then I just try to look across a range of different polls to just sort of see what the different numbers are looking like. Ultimately, there is information to be gleaned, but you just have to be very careful and thoughtful to not overinterpret the numbers.
Okay, so let's go through a few of these items piece by piece, and I think this will be really interesting. When you talk to pollsters, they will often give a convoluted but seemingly well-intentioned answer about sample size, where they say, once you get beyond, assuming you have the right sort of distribution and a representative sample, that once you get beyond, some will say 800, 1,000, 1,200 respondents, that you are not going to be better or have more accurate results than if you were to double or continue increasing the sample size. Is that true? And if so, how is it backed up mathematically?
Okay, well, actually, it's mathematically true with respect to only one type of error, and that's what we call sampling error. What they are right truly as a matter of math is that if you believe you have the sample right and you have a truly representative sample, then to eliminate the type of error which comes from the fact that we just can't ask every single person, that's why that, or how that margin of error gets smaller and smaller. And it is absolutely true that as you go from 1,000 to 2,000 to 5,000, the decline in the margin of error gets smaller and smaller. But where I think it's a little bit misguided and perhaps off is that with all those other types of errors that are really important, non-response bias, representativeness, How much are the people that you're talking to actually representative of the broader population? With respect to those other things, I think you can get increases in accuracy by polling more people. So it kind of plays off of a very common mistake that people make. Margin of error is just about one type of bias or error in a sample or poll, but there are many others that actually are often far more important. And by taking or getting more data, we usually always think as statisticians and economists, the more data, the better. If we can get more data and it's cost effective, which is really what it comes down to, then we probably prefer it and could get better answers.
Okay, as far as margin of error, many understand margin of error to mean the following. If we have a poll that has Hillary Clinton polling 50% and Donald Trump polling 45%, for example, if you have a 4% margin of error, that means that although the results say Hillary Clinton 50, she may actually be at 46 or may actually be at 54, and that this sort of same 4-point swing would exist for the numbers of Donald Trump. Is that a useful and or accurate understanding of margin of error?
I think it's a partial understanding. Let me put a little finer point on it. When we're talking about the margin of error, we're truly talking about what would happen if we repeated the same sample or the same poll over and over and over. Would we find that we would get the actual value, the actual amount of support amongst all the voters, what we call the entire population, 95 out of 100 times? That's when we talk about the 95% confidence interval. So it's really about whether or not, given the fact that we're only sampling a small number of people, can we do that? So yes, what you are correct when you describe it is that our confidence of what that true, whether or not the true population, the true value as we think of it for the support for Hillary or the support for Trump has got to be within that range. And so when we say, if we look at the lower end of the confidence interval for Hillary and the higher end of the confidence interval for Trump, if those two overlap, then we usually say we can't be confident that those two things are anything different than a statistical tie from the pure statistical standpoint. That's the way I like to think of it. And the reality is right now, given where most of the poll numbers are in this election, we're finding generally that we're within the margin of error for a number of the polls. And then there are a few where it's statistically Hillary Clinton is ahead.
Okay, now you mentioned at the beginning that an individual poll's importance is smaller, but that an average of polls can be a better way to sort of interpret poll data in terms of its predictive value. Back in 2012, and I say this not to pat myself on the back because many, many people did this, I had a 100% correct electoral map, and all I did was look at an average of state polls and say, okay, if the average in Pennsylvania is that President Obama is ahead, I'll fill that in blue, so on and so forth. And many people sort of did this. Is that surprising to you when we look at basically 50 individual elections in a presidential election? And can you talk about some of the ways in that looking at the average of polls might lead you astray?
Sure. So first thing I would say is that, well, first, congratulations on getting 50 right. The reality is probably 38 of those were pretty much most people could get right before looking at any polls. And it's probably the last 12 that is really where the differences are. And that's not meant to diminish your accomplishment. I'm just saying as a practical matter.
No, diminish away by all means.
So that's the first thing, is that those 12, probably 12 states, what we always call sort of the battleground states, are usually the ones that make a difference. You raised the very important point that we get these national poll numbers every day. Oh, nationally, here's what the numbers show. But what really matters is the Electoral College. And one of the other interesting things about the whole margin of error discussion, which directly ties to this, is that a margin of error is calculated on the total number of respondents in the poll. But let's say we cared about voters in the state of New York, and we only had 30 New York voters in a sample with 1,000 people. Well, the margin of error on the New York estimate is much, much larger. It's only based on those 30 people. You never hear people, or very rarely have I seen people report that the margins of errors get much, much larger if you look at any subgroup in a poll. So national polls are somewhat limited in their value in terms of actually predicting Electoral College, particularly when you think about the specific states. So the first thing that I think is a really valid point is looking closer at state polls, a very useful thing, I think, for a consumer to do. Now, with respect to averages, I have kind of mixed feelings on this. Averages can be powerful, And when you have so many polls, there are times where looking across the averages at least tell you something a little bit more long-term about trends, tends to take out the sort of extreme values and the like. One of the problems with those averages, though, is that there is no margin of error calculated ever on those polls. And most of the averages just assume all polls are of equal quality. But I can tell you that when you actually look at the questions that some of these polling agencies ask, there are some that are very reputable, and there are some that are not. And that's actually a really big issue. I was looking at one today from 2012, where an agency had asked Republican voters if they were in favor of bombing Agrabah. And 30% said yes. Well, Agrabah is the town from the movie Aladdin. And they sort of had this big elaborate joke about, 30% of Republican voters support bombing Agrabah.
Right.
When I looked back at the questions, they had 8 questions all about 9/11 and terrorist attacks right before it. They asked the same questions of Democrats, and the questions were much more limited, basically about presidential candidates, and then the question. And so polling can really, bad poll questions still exist. So don't think that all polls are created equal. They are not. And remember, those averages basically incorporate everything into one big average number.
John, real quick in the limited time we have left, for our audience who wants to look into some examples of how the same data can be used to paint drastically different pictures of reality, do you have some favorite examples that people could look or research about how representations of statistics can reflect the data but be very, very misleading?
Yeah, well, that's a big part of my book, Everydata. I didn't write the book to sort of be a purely political commentary. In fact, many of the examples in the book are about sort of everyday examples of times where people have misrepresented data, either graphically with numbers and the like. And we have everything in the book from why you shouldn't trust representations like 4 out of 5 pediatricians prefer a certain baby food to why when you read a story that says eating grilled cheese will improve your sex life, you don't necessarily want to run out and start eating grilled cheese, at least not based on the statistics. So I would point that's where a lot of it is. I also have launched recently, in addition to my book website, I also have a blog purely on these political issues off of johnhjohnsonphd.com. And that's a good place to find all sorts of examples where I've been talking about all these same polling issues we discussed today.
Very, very important stuff for anybody who wants to be an informed and competent consumer of not only news, but also advertising, which is where you hear so many of these misleading statistics used. The book is Everydata, the misinformation hidden in the little data you consume every day. We've been speaking with the book's co-author, John Johnson. So great to talk to you. Thank you.
Great talking to you too. Thank you.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Every indication is that an endorsement of Hillary Clinton by Bernie Sanders is coming very, very soon. And indeed, Senator Bernie Sanders today acknowledged what has already been widely reported, which is that tomorrow he is going to be joining the presumptive Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton on the campaign trail in New Hampshire. Are the Bernie supporters ready to stop talking about paths to victory? And I don't ask this in any kind of demeaning way. My Facebook stream, Lewis, is filled with long posts from friends saying it isn't over. Here is how it's going to happen. There is how it's going to happen. I truly do not get it. And here, every indication that although we have not yet seen an endorsement, we will see one soon. Typically, Lewis, if you're still running a campaign, you don't show up to rally for the other candidates, do you?
No, not usually. I've been seeing Facebook posts saying that the stories about Bernie endorsing Hillary are a hoax. And the Bernie or busters are still at it.
Yeah.
And that's fine, I guess, if you're not doing any harm, really. But
no,
eventually,
but my concern is at some point, a disconnection from reality will become problematic, right? In some way, shape, or form, at some point, reality is going to have to set in, and there are going to have to be some real serious considerations made. And I know after our video saying Bernie or bust, while understandable, doesn't make practical sense, We received a ton of hate for it, and I stand by everything we said there, Lewis, no doubt about it. Let me be clear, as someone who voted for Bernie Sanders here in Massachusetts and feels that Hillary Clinton is not progressive enough, I still received hate for that video, and I believe everything we said in the video made practical sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, they're somewhat fanatic, but the convention is going to happen.
Yeah.
We're going to have a nominee.
Right.
And then there will be two choices. It most likely you will have to, what will they decide?
Well, this
either
is
not to vote or to vote for Hillary.
Well, this is the two choices thing. Some are saying Bernie's a hypocrite, right? Jill Stein from the Green Party has offered Bernie Sanders. She said she would be open to stepping down as the Green Party nominee and letting Bernie Sanders take that over, and that he should be doing that instead of going out there and campaigning with Hillary.
Then you hand the election to Trump.
Bernie Sanders taking over the Green Party nomination potentially gives the election to Donald Trump. Hate me for it. I don't care. How can I buy into the two-party blah, blah, blah? I know the emails I'll get. Trust me. It's July of 2016. If Bernie Sanders joins the Green Party today, Donald Trump's chances of being the next president jump dramatically. And if I'm Bernie Sanders, do I want to be responsible for that? I'm not. If Bernie Sanders is not the burn it all down, so in 4, 8, 16, 20, 24 years, we can rebuild. That is not the Bernie Sanders approach. So if you're angry with Bernie for that approach, go to it. But it would be utter disaster.
Yeah, it seems like there are two types of voters. The voters who vote and make a decision so that they can feel good about themselves,
right?
And the voters who think about the macro and the bigger picture and vote to, logically.
If you want a better path forward, we need instant runoff voting. That is the system that would allow you to show up and say, okay, Bernie's running third party. My first choice is Bernie Sanders. If after the first tally is done, Bernie Sanders does not have a plurality of votes, then my vote goes to Hillary Clinton. And this is a system which we have talked about many times, which party insiders do not want for obvious reasons, that would alleviate not all, but many of the issues that our current system has. Lewis, last week when I told you that Fox chief Roger Ailes had been accused of sexual harassment, or harassment, as some people like to say, by former Fox anchor Gretchen Carlson, first of all, I said, who's really surprised by the allegations she's making about a total boys club environment at Fox News? But I also said something else, and I want to play that for you now, seeing these settlements.
Or imagine if this turns into a slander case.
Imagine if it turns into a Bill Cosby situation, where all of a sudden others come out of the woodwork.
That would be fantastic. I hope that happens.
Well, it is happening. 6 more women have indeed come out of the woodwork alleging that Roger Ailes sexually harassed them. Back in 2014, Gabriel Sherman wrote a biography of Roger Ailes, and he included interviews with 4 women who told him that Roger Ailes used his positions of power either to make unwanted sexual advances or made inappropriate sexual comments in the office. And now, in the days following Gretchen Carlson's lawsuit, more than 12 women have contacted Carlson's attorney, Nancy Erica Smith, and have detailed very specific allegations of sexual harassment by Ailes over a 25-year period dating all the way back to the 1960s when he was a producer on The Mike Douglas Show. The big picture is that Roger Ailes was habitually expecting women to perform sexual favors in exchange for job opportunities. Of the 12 women, 6 agreed to speak with New York Magazine publicly for the first time, 2 on the record. 4 for fear of shame and fear of retribution, spoke off the record. The on-the-record individuals include Kelly Boyle, who says that Ailes propositioned her in 1989, and Marcia Callahan, a former model who says that Ailes harassed her in the late 60s, shortly before she became Richard Nixon's media advisor. Some of the other women span from models and TV producers to media consultants and actresses. What is Ailes doing? Well, first of all, he's trying to make it so that these women can't be part of Gretchen Carlson's lawsuit, and a motion has been filed to take the lawsuit into arbitration. And what that would do, Lewis, is essentially make this a private matter to be arbitrated as opposed to a trial in a public court, and it would put the entire thing behind closed doors. No surprise that Ailes is doing that.
No surprise. None of this is a surprise. The harassment claims, not a surprise. I would really like to start looking at the comments about this from the Fox News fans, particularly.
We know what they're saying, Lewis. It's the normal stuff. David, this is an innocent man in the eyes of the law. He's innocent until proven guilty. He will likely pay his way out of this, by the way, and never be found guilty. Yeah, I get that. But in the eyes of reasonable people who analyze the world in a way that's consistent with what we know, Ailes is exactly the type of person, and the Fox News chief is the exact type of, Fox News is the exact type of organization that would make this completely believable. Oh, but David, you're being a social justice warrior, lefty loon, because you're saying an innocent man is guilty. I'm not saying he's legally guilty. In my opinion, we have to look at what we know, and there may be no proven legal guilt here, but there's no mitigating evidence, right? If all these women came out and said what a great guy Ailes is, you might have, okay, well, wow, all these people are jumping to his defense. Let's consider that. That's not happening. If the women's stories were drastically different, right? Oh, he gave me Quaaludes and then slapped me around before propositioning me. And someone else says, oh, he brought in security. But the stories are all more or less the same idea, that he's using his position of power to imply directly or explicitly or implicitly that sexual favors can be exchanged for positions of jobs or whatever the case may be. Reasonable people would say women over decades that don't know each other. Very similar case to the Bill Cosby story, which, by the way, I get killed on all the time. I'm not talking about legal guilt here.
Yeah, you're entitled to your opinion.
Thank you.
And it's too bad that people didn't speak up sooner about this decades ago.
Yeah.
That's when that was the time. And now, even if there are consequences for him, ultimately, it really doesn't matter.
Can you imagine how different Fox News Channel would look if these charges had been brought against him before the statute of limitations had expired on some of these old cases? Maybe drastically different.
I don't know. Maybe. Impossible to say.
We have a voicemail number, 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's a voicemail I received about conspiracy theorists.
Oh, and the term conspiracy theorist, that term was invented by the government in order to delegitimize people who actually had dug up some dirt on corrupt government officials.
Okay. Well, be that as it may, it's still used to describe people that have completely unsubstantiated and very belligerent ideas about many phenomena in the real world. On the bonus show today, we will talk about the pleasure of missing out. We will talk about a man who filmed the Baton Rouge shooting being arrested. And we will also talk about a kale eating competition. Will Lewis be participating? Will he bring his own quinoa, or will he expect it to be provided for him there? All of these questions will be answered today on the bonus show. davidpakman.com/membership to sign up and get instant access.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.